Anybody think she's sexy? Keep in mind she's a cartoon. Just saying, that's reminds me of the rabbit's wife in the one where she says, "I'm not bad, I'm just drawn that way." I can't remember the name of the movie. Who Framed Roger Rabbit? How many of you know this song in English by heart? Right? So I figured, no point in playing it in English. I might as well pick a different language. So she's offering a different interpretation of everything than what he's used to, right? He's treating everything like a thing to be harvested or mined or shot. Even things like trees and the wind. She's personalizing or anthropomorphizing all of those things. By the way, I don't recommend picking up a bear cub in the den and fondling it. That's probably not safe. So there's some. So how old was she in that, supposedly? 14?
14. He was like, what, 30?
Of course, this is just a Disney cartoon, so. Notice this is from 1977. So.
Chomsky probably, though strictly speaking, he's not exactly a philosopher. Well, the first of those names, the one which I believe pretty short of, is that of Willard Van Orman Quine, one of the professors of philosophy at Harvard. Quine was born in 1908 and is still highly productive, so he's had a long career.
He died December 2000, I think.
He published innumerable articles and over a dozen books, the best known of which are From a Logical Point of View, published in 1953, and Word and Object, published in 1960. First and foremost, he's a logician, and the original contributions to the subject which made him famous are for the most part highly technical and not really accessible to the lay, though it always had their ultimate views in problems fundamental to philosophy. However, in the latter part of his career, he's become more overtly interested in philosophy in a more general sense. And I thought it would be uniquely valuable in this program to have a philosopher at the very solid of the world's reputation talking about the basics of philosophy and of his own ethics. Professor Quine, what do you regard as the central task of philosophy?
I think philosophy has to do with the with our knowledge of the world and the nature of the world, I think of philosophy as attempting to round up the system of the world, as Newton put it. There have been philosophers who have thought of philosophy as somehow separate from science and as providing a firm basis on which to build science. But this, I consider an intervening science. Much of science is firmer than philosophy is, or can even perhaps aspire to be. I think of philosophy as continuous with science, even as a part of science.
And if it's continuous with science, and even part of science, how does it differ from the rest of science?
It differs in generality, in abstractness. Science is a continuum extending from history and engineering at one end, if you think of science broadly, to such abstract pursuits as philosophy and mathematics. Yeah. Philosophy considers the question of the nature of thought, for instance, where physics contents itself with finding causal relations between specific sources of events, biology between other sources of events. Again, whereas the zoologist will tell us that there are wombats and physicists will tell us that there are electrons, the mathematician will tell us there are only prime numbers, the philosopher is interested in what sorts of things there are altogether. In these ways, the philosophy is more abstract.
In other words, the philosopher is investigating what constitutes the connective tissue of everyone's thought, including other people's thought. So that the physicist is trying to find out whether or not A causes B, but the philosopher is saying, well, but what does it mean to say that anything causes anything? The physicist is trying to find out, say, what particular particles there are. And the philosopher says, but what does it mean to say of anything that it exists?
Yeah.
It's at this level of complete generality the philosopher's investigation occurs. Is that right? Now, do you include this, or do you exclude from the age-old questions of how the world got here in the first place, or how life began?
I exclude from philosophy. How the world began is a problem for a physicist and astronomer, and of course there have been conjectures from that work. How life began is a problem for a biologist, and which has made notable progress in recent years. Why the world began, why life began, and there again, I think are pseudo-questions. Because I can't write it from the answer to that.
You think that because there's no perceivable answer to these questions, they are meaningless questions?
Yes.
In other words, you regard the central task of philosophy as the analysis and elucidation of concepts that are central to various fields of human activity, and also, in particular, notions like what it is for something to be a cause of something else, what it is for something to exist, what it is for something to be, shall we say, a scientific law, the most general notions that are, as it were, the connecting tissue of thought, and that we have to use, we have to employ in the specific activities that people like scientists, like politicians, lawyers, and so on, are engaged in. Is that a correct way of putting your view?
Yes, I believe.
Do you think that the main or most important questions that philosophers have to deal with can be grouped under any particular heading?
There are two heads, which I think provide an important classification to begin with. There are the ontological questions that you mentioned before.
Well, I think you need to explain that term.
These are the questions as to what the general question, as to what sorts of things there are, as well as the question of what means to, what means for the disease. And the other classification, the other class, would be might be called the predicate. Question is, what sorts of things can meaningfully be asked in that activity?
In other words, we've got two enormous spheres of questions here. One about what there is, and the other about what we can know, or what we can say.
Yes, and epistemology would be included in the latter. Yes.
Now, I think since you've made this distinction, for clarity's sake,
So that's Willard Van Orman Quine on the left, obviously, and Brian McGee, who's an interesting philosopher himself, on the right, doing the interview. Brian McGee, by the way, is still alive. He's in his 80s, but he is living in a retirement home in England somewhere. So I don't know that he's doing any more work. But he's very interesting himself. He did a long series of interviews with major philosophers for the BBC, and this is just one of those. So if you're curious about all the different philosophers he interviewed, during that time period, he interviewed all sorts of folks. Iris Murdoch, for example, Hilary Putnam, also all sorts of folks. Quine, I got to see myself in a lecture at my alma mater when I was in school. And the lecture he gave us was precisely on this topic. The question was, what do mathematical logicians, which he was as his specialty in philosophy at Harvard, and he's got an interesting life all on his own. He was originally from Ohio. He not only went to Harvard, got his PhD there, but also was sent to Europe to study. While there, met a lot of the logicians and philosophers that the United States kind of recruited to come teach in the United States prior to the Nazi takeover, which was one of the reasons why a lot of them lived, of course. And during that time, he attended meetings of the Vienna Circle, where he met Kurt Gödel, I think Wittgenstein, and a few others. There were Tarski, others. But he was also in the Navy during World War II, and as an officer, he worked in the Washington, D.C. area, decoding Nazi naval traffic. That was how they helped know where the various submarines off the East Coast were. So that's kind of interesting. But he, in his lecture that I attended, his explanation for what mathematical logicians' main job today at that time was, and that was in the 70s, was to help physicists know what there is. The problem that physicists had was that their findings did not cooperate with the English language, because English, if you've noticed, requires nouns and predicates, or subjects and predicates. And the problem with physics, once you get down to the problem of the subparticles, quarks and things, those particles actually do not exist, at least not for very long. They go in and out of existence. And so the problem the physicists were having was that they were not objects. You couldn't refer to them as nouns. And so how do you talk about them in English or even in mathematical language unless you have some way of doing it? And so the invention of predicate logic was part of what he was doing, and that's where you have variables that you predicate sets of characteristics to. And so for all x, if it is a man, then it is mortal, for example. So x is a variable. It doesn't necessarily stand for a particular object. It stands for a set of characteristics. So in a sense, that covers what the physicists needed. What he demonstrated to us in his lecture was that while the way objects were thought of, if you had two particles in two boxes, you could have all these different possibilities. You could have both particles in one box, box A. You could have both particles in box B. You could have one in A, one in B. But normally you could also have them reversed so that the other was in A and the other's in B. But in modern physics, that was not a possibility because the particles are not identifiable as a specific object. Instead, what the physicists are encountering is the arrangement of things, the arrangement of forces, right? So in other words, the predicate, what you could say about them, right? So they weren't existing per se. What was existing was sort of the arrangement. There's a neat, I think I've shown parts of the movie Mind Walk. Not Welk. Let's see if I could find this very specific section here. I think I've played parts of this before.
Everybody knows the chord is the third, and the most basic of harmony. Very good and a very distinctive feeling, no? And yet, its individual notes very nice. Therefore, the essence of the chord lies in relationships. And the relationship between time and pitch makes melody. Relationships make music.
Relationships make matter.
Music of the sphere.
A sketch lesson.
And Shakespeare before.
Thrilling movie, if you ever get a chance to watch it. Pretty neat, though, how it focuses on it. So today the topic is ontology, and the particular philosopher, what? I didn't mean to do that. Where am I? There we go. Are you guys having fun? Fun is important. Okay. So February 19th. So if you had a chance to, number one, read the article, of course, and watch. I'm sorry, it was kind of a little more tedious lecture that she offered because she got into quite a lot of detail. If you noticed on YouTube, there was a earlier lecture that she did on the same topic when she was a little bit younger. Happens when it's earlier like that, which I thought was a little less tedious. It might have been the audience was different. But basically she's talking about contemporary ontological issues. That's her specialty, and especially with regard to ontological issues in art. So and some of the art that she mentions, you could look up, and I don't know if you did it or not. You tried that. If you guys are addicted to the internet, as I am, but there was the one piece that she talked about, which is a shelf full of jars of canned vegetables and things. Did you notice that? me see if I can. But well, I don't actually have to pull it up. But if you pull it up on Google, the art that she mentions, each of them actually, you can find pictures of them and get a sense of what she's talking about. But the one she's talking about is basically a shelf full of canned goods. They're not canned goods, but they're the homemade canning. So glass mason jars with various kinds of vegetables and so on. And the point she makes about that is that this is not a particular art piece that's going to persist for very long, right? The problem with it, of course, is the canned goods are going to rot eventually, and actually that would be quite the waste. What you ought to do is eat them before they do rot, right? So as an art project, that's what kind of ontological status does it have? When we think of a painting, and I think of like the Mona Lisa. I don't have as much room here as I'd like. But if we think of the Mona Lisa, everyone's familiar with the Mona Lisa, I'm sure. I suppose that's considered by some to be the most famous painting in the world. Yes, some of these are obviously comical. There she is smoking a oddly shaped cigarette. I don't know exactly what. That's obviously home rolled, so I don't know. That's the Mona Lisa Wasilla, I suppose. That could have been a joke, but nobody laughed. Okay. Obviously, there are some differences here. So, for example, this one, the Mona Lisa that can you see that? Is the one that's in the Prada Museum. This one that's sort of yellowish, is the one that's in the Louvre. And the Louvre is the one that was in his room when he died, Da Vinci died. And the reason it's yellowish is because it's been gathering darker coloration from the protective film on the painting, and it hasn't been cleaned up in years because they're worried of losing something spectacular about the painting if they clean it up. But the one here that's in the Prada was cleaned up, and you could see if the colors were supposed to be similar, that obviously it's a lot brighter. The blue of the sky is much brighter. The gold in her neckline and the silver and the bright colors in her hair, etc., are all somewhat different because of the cleaning process. So there's a big argument over whether they should clean it or not. If you have some of you been to the Louvre or the Prada and seen it in person? Anybody? Yes. What did you think? Was it worth the wait? Absolutely not. Yeah, I wouldn't think so. I've been to the Louvre via Oculus Rift as a Google Earth visitor, right? So you just put the goggles on and you stay home. You don't have to get in line. You don't have to pay the fee. It's free, except for buying the Oculus Rift and the computer to run it, right? And the internet, right? Which, you might do all that anyway, right? But having done that and seeing the crowd always in that room, it looks incredibly miserable to me. Although I suppose there's something absolutely spectacular about having spent all that money, gone to Paris in whatever weather you're lucky to get, fighting the crowds to go into the museum, being one of the folks that are all ooh and ah over the Mona Lisa in the one corner, while at the same time all around you are other spectacular paintings. Did you hopefully enjoy some of the other ones? Yes, okay. When you look at the pictures, though, everybody's all looking at this one little painting behind the glass to make sure that no one else throws any more rocks and stuff at it. Apparently they have. But, by the way, you're all sitting here and you're looking at that, which is the Mona Lisa. Are you looking at the Mona Lisa? Or are you not looking at the Mona Lisa? Discuss. We're talking ontology here, right? What is the Mona Lisa? It's an object. It exists on actually multiple walls, because there's more than one copy. All original. I mean, and some of them are obviously done by Da Vinci, not just the one that he was working on when he died. The others were copies, although he also had students, and the students were copying them. So, of course, no one can be absolutely sure, although if you've read about Da Vinci, remember he was left-handed, so when they see signs of a left-hander painting on the painting, they conclude that that was Da Vinci. That was one of the signs that that's an original Da Vinci and not one of his students. But all of those artists back in that time had students and were students themselves of other masters, so that a lot of their work are literally blended works from all of the individuals that were working in the studio, not just the one individual, right? And there were multiple copies. There was something special about this painting that they really liked it, and so they had lots of opportunities to redo this one particular painting. If you go to a museum, you often see the benches in the middle of a particular room, and by the way, be careful, because some of those benches are objects that you're not supposed to sit on. Be careful, they might be older than the paintings that are on the wall, depending, but if they are benches and they're obviously there that you're allowed to sit on them, you often see young students sitting there with their easels, painting their own copies of the paintings that they're looking at on the wall. And that's not discouraged, that's encouraged. That's an education, right? Doing that. So you'll see that. So who knows how many copies of this there are. So which one would you say is the Mona Lisa? That's, of course, a question that's obviously a trick, right? Because there's so many variants of that. But at least you can ensure, I'm sure the Louvre has an incredible amount of insurance on that painting in case of damage, because they want it, replaced? I'm not sure how you would take care of that, right? But compare that to something else like this, because that's painting. So when you have a painting, you know what the object is. I have all sorts of paintings at home. I have prints. At home, for example, I have a nice print of the Mona Lisa in a frame. And frankly, it's not quite that size, but notice that size picture that you're looking at on the screen is larger than the actual painting, right? Whereas the one I have framed is, I think, 14 by 17 or something like that. Whatever the maximum size was of one of those big printers, right? And as far as I'm concerned, when I had it in my office and I could just look at that, that was as good, I thought, and way cheaper than going to the Louvre or even the Prada Museum. By the way, whenever I see pictures of the Prada Museum's Mona Lisa, no one else is in the room. What the heck? It doesn't make sense why that would be. But how about this kind of art? Oh, well, I should do this. Pick a number from 1 to 9. 2? Nah. Pick a higher number. 5? Okay. 2 is a good number, it's just that it's not really one of his best. 5, actually I need to go 5th, right? You know what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to pick, here we go. Who is this? Leonard Bernstein? That's the Vienna Philharmonic, Leonard Bernstein. See, if we had used 2, probably you wouldn't have recognized it. Unless you're a real aficionado of Beethoven. Because his second is a lot more like Mozart. Although a lot of Mozart is like Beethoven too, so they were obviously, and Haydn, if you're familiar with Haydn. By the way, I think it's this weekend, one of Haydn's masses is being performed in town. So here's the question. What is Beethoven's symphony? Is there an object that is the symphony? See the dilemma? Wouldn't even be the sheet music. There's multiple copies of that all over. Right? Could you ensure Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? Could it be lost? So I can think of all kinds of interesting problems here. One, for example, is if we think of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony as the symphony actually being performed live by an orchestra, even though we're listening to a live performance that was taped and then reduced to a YouTube video so that we could watch it on the screen. I don't know how close, how much of the actual sound are we losing? Quite a lot, I would imagine, right? I remember talking with one of the professors here in the music department, and I asked him, this was years ago, I said, which do you prefer, vinyl records or CDs? And he looked at me with horror on his face, and he said, I never listened to recorded music. How embarrassing, right? It ruins your ear. He said, oh, well, I would never get to listen to music then, except for, the very occasional attendance. By the way, I came to listen to the Baroque cello concert on Friday night, and when my daughter and I arrived to buy our tickets, we discovered that they were all sold out. So we didn't get to see it. So we went to see Alita Battle Angel instead. Which, there is no live performance of that. We saw the movie, right? But of course, if we had been here listening to the Baroque cello concert right here, I'm sure, we would have been at the real performance, perhaps. I don't know what he performed, but I'm supposing one of Bach's cello sonatas, maybe, or something. I don't know. But you get the idea. That's a puzzle, right? What's the symphony? What's the concerto? What's the sonata? What's the, Does it have to be live? Can it be lost? Certainly it could be lost if we don't have any musicians capable of playing all the parts for a symphonic orchestra. It's one of my odd priorities, is never live in a town that doesn't have an orchestra. And knock on wood, Anchorage is touch and go. That's, well, if you've been to our orchestra, they do a pretty good job for a city this size. It's absolutely amazing, actually, how good an orchestra we have. But Amy talks about the problem of art that doesn't persist. A bed, for example, that the artist just got up out of that morning, for example. And there it is on display in the museum for everyone to see. That's her messy bed, the way she got out of it this morning. Now, and obviously it's not really where she slept each night. It's a bed that's been deliberately messed up and left there as an artwork that a museum actually this is the one I'm thinking of, right? So that's a museum piece. And you think, wow, that's pretty crappy. Who wants to see that? I told you about the pewter dog shit that I saw in the Museum of Modern Art. Did I tell you about the piece in the Hirshhorn Museum that I got yelled at? I did, because it was in the dark, and I didn't realize it when I didn't read the sign. So I ran in, and the guard that was in there, in the dark, yelled at me and said, "Sir, you're in the art." Where is it? You're in it. Come out of there. Oh, okay. Silly stuff, right? And yet, it's art. But you can see the problem if we're ontologically trying to discover or figure out what things exist, what things are nouns, etc. And what can you say about them? Going back to Willard Van Orman Quine, his most famous article, the one that made him famous, came out in 1952, and it was titled "Two Dogmas of Empiricism." And I should briefly explain that. But the dogmas that he talks about really are dependent on Aristotle's square of opposition. Which I've shown you before. So when you look at this traditional square, there's four kinds of statements that we could make that are true or false. Notice that the top two are universals. I think I've mentioned this, right? That all S is P, no S is P. So they're both universals. Whereas the ones at the bottom of the square, the I statement and the O statement are particulars. So they're talking about some S is P, some S is not P. So in the tradition, the top two statements were analytic. And they're analytic because they're essentially definitions. So, all horses are animals. That's part of the definition of a horse. So basically that's true of all horses regardless of the specific horse you're talking about, right? The specific characteristics I might have when I talk about a particular horse, that horse is a gelding, for example. That's not true of all horses, that's just true of that particular horse in this case, right? And so I'm talking as a particular statement referring to an existent object. I actually don't have to refer to any specific horse in the statement, all horses are animals. It's an analytic statement. It's a reference to the entire set. And I'm not referring to a specific existing object. In fact, if it happened that there are no horses at all left because of some devastating horse plague or something horrible, right? If there are no horses left, I could still say all horses are animals, and by definition that would still be true even though there aren't any horses left. It would be a problem if I were to say that horse is an animal because, well, if there is no horse, you would say that's false because there is no horse. So there's a problem when you're referring to a specific horse. We expect that particular horse to exist. So it's an ontological requirement for that statement to be true, that you have the particular subject you're referring to as existing, right? Whereas if I'm talking about an entire set, that doesn't seem to be a requirement. So for example, I can even talk about things like unicorns. All unicorns have a single horn, and notice that seems to be true, right? It's a definition, right? Everyone here, I think, would agree, right? That's the definition of a unicorn. They have a single horn, right? So the tradition believed that analytic knowledge was knowledge that you had one type of knowledge that you had. By knowing those definitions, you could do that scholarly, know stuff, basically study the definitions, and you know all the things that are true about those. Aristotle, in his theory of knowledge, argued that all knowledge was categorical. So basically all you had to do was properly categorize everything, define the subjects, and say what predicates applied to them. And if you did that to everything that there was, and the interrelationships between them, so all horses are animals, all horses are ruminants, all cows are ruminants, but it's not the case that cows are horses, right? So that list of all of that stuff, an encyclopedia, basically, would be all knowledge. And that was what Aristotle essentially thought knowledge would be. So Aristotle famously was the father of botany, biology, zoology, etc., because he basically wanted to categorize everything. If you look up Aristotle's works, we could probably go to the Internet Archive. We could go to browse, take a look at the works by Aristotle. Notice they're over here on the right. And notice we have the Athenian constitution, categories, on dreams, on the gait of animals, on generation and corruption, that's birth and death, on the heavens, that's astronomy, the history of animals, on interpretation, on longevity and shortness of life, kind of diet you should have and stuff, on memory and reminiscence, the metaphysics, meteorology, weather, right? On the motion of animals, how they move, all the different kinds of animals, the Nicomachean ethics, which he does the same thing. He describes everything very specifically in the Nicomachean ethics. And that, by the way, that's a very famous book. If you think of the famous painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. Just pick one. I guess this one looks good. So notice, I know that's pretty small, but if you look right here at the center, this is Plato, and this is Aristotle. And in fact, the point where everything converges, I shouldn't have done that, the vanishing point is right between the two of them. I didn't want to do that. There we go. So here's Aristotle. Notice Aristotle is in the earth colors of water and dirt, so brown and blue. Plato is in sky colors, blue and red for fire or sun, right? The vanishing point I mentioned is in the middle. We don't know who Raphael used as a model for Aristotle, but everyone is in agreement that Da Vinci was the model he used for Plato. So that's kind of cool. But you could look at paintings of Da Vinci and the older paintings, and it's recognizably Da Vinci that's there as Plato. By the way, that's considered odd because Da Vinci was a known Aristotelian, not a Platonist, so that's kind of dumb. I don't know why. You'd have to figure that one out, I suppose. But by the way, this painting is in the Vatican Library, the Pope's library, and it's on the wall that represents reason. And it's got all the philosophers that were famous at the time. If you look, this is Socrates over here talking with all of his normal friends, and then you have, by the way, Raphael and his assistant are the only two that are here down on the bottom right, and they're looking at you, etc. So you could basically look at a list of who all of these philosophers were. Obviously, Raphael had no clue what they all looked like. This was a Renaissance painting, and obviously he wouldn't have had anything to go on really to paint actual portraits of the great philosophers, etc. But there's a lot of speculation on who the different models were that would have been available for him to paint this. It's a mural on the wall, so they would have had to have been there at the library for it, I suppose. But so when we think about Aristotle in that painting, by the way, the reason I mentioned it is he's actually carrying the book Ethics. So that's his Nicomachean Ethics that he's carrying. Plato is carrying the Timaeus in his hand. By the way, Aristotle is pointing like this, which is considered, he's an empiricist, he's pointing down, and Plato's pointing up. He's an idealist, so as far as he's concerned, all knowledge is up there. Whereas Aristotle says, no, it's down here, right? So that's kind of a cool single summary of all sorts of things about philosophy. But so on the parts of animals, physics, poetics, politics, posterior analytics, which is part of the organon, the tool, the logic tool. The prior analytics, the other part, prophesizing by dreams, rhetoric, how you make a speech that is going to be persuasive, for example. On sense and the sensible, on sleep and sleeplessness, on sophistical refutations. What's that all about? Well, once he invented logic with his organon, he then went back and looked at the arguments of his teachers and discovered that they were full of fallacies. So he's refuting or pointing out all the fallacies in his teachers' arguments, right? On the soul, right? For Aristotle, the soul, while Plato believed that the soul was invisible, eternal, unchanging, well, I mean, basically it had no parts, so you couldn't destroy it. By the way, neither could it be created. But that was us, as our soul for Plato, right? But for Aristotle, there was no such thing existing unless it had substance. And so what was the soul for Aristotle? His answer was the body's activity was the soul. Topics, virtues and vices, and on youth and old age. And by the way, these are just what we have. There was supposedly lots of other works by Aristotle that were lost. So Aristotle argued that basically all knowledge is going to be categorical, which means basically analytic. Once you define everything properly, you essentially and then know it, and then you know everything. That's how you become knowledgeable. By the way, that was what people believed all the way through the Middle Ages, which is one of the reasons why they didn't really have much of a scientific enterprise, because they believed all knowledge was already there. All you needed to do was read the right book and you knew everything, right? Because Aristotle had already gathered all knowledge. So until they began realizing that Aristotle didn't know a lot of things, and that started the modern scientific revolution that of course changed all of that. But so Quine, in his Two Dogmas of Empiricism, discovers an interesting problem here, and that is that if I take the statement, every S is P, and I negate what we would call the quantifier, right? So the quantifier of a statement is how many, right? Quantity. So the statement gives us a quantifier. So in both of the analytic statements, the universal statements, you're talking about all the members of the set, the subject set, right? So they're universal. So the quantifier for those two statements is the universal quantifier. If I'm talking about a particular statement, like some S is P, then I'm using the existential quantifier because I'm insisting that a particular object exists that is the subject of my sentence, right? So we use different symbols for a universal quantifier, just X, for example, but for the I or O statement, the quantifier we use is the existential quantifier. So usually a backwards E and an X. So there exists an X such that, right? So the quantifiers. So if I take an A statement and I put an X down as my quantifier, but in front of that X I say a negation sign, and then following that X before the statement, I put another negation sign. I have basically, it's not the case that for anything you pick, is not the case, right? That statement turns out to be equivalent to there exists an X such that this is the case. They're equivalent. In fact, this becomes a rule. It's called the quantifier exchange. Let me see if I can find. Okay. So in this particular picture, can you see it? Yes? This one? Okay. Notice they're using this bar as the negation sign. There's your, it's actually a forward EX for an existential quantifier, right? But from that, you could conclude, and now they're, instead of just X, they're using the upside down A, which is the quantifier all, right? Not P. So notice they doubled the negation, which does away with it, in the front of the quantifier, and they added the negation behind it. So they're following this particular rule. You could just change the quantifier by putting a negation in front of and after the quantifier and change it. So it's called quantifier exchange rule. And this is something that Quine develops, and what you end up knowing then is that analytic statements are equivalent to particular statements. That means that the traditional square of opposition has been wrong for about 2,500 years. Instead, we're constantly updating our database of information depending on whether or not things in our environment reflect what we know. So we can't trust our analytic information. As soon as we see an example in front of us that is contrary to that known database, we have to update that. So we have to count on our experience, verifying our knowledge, our analytic knowledge. So this was a dogma of empiricism, that these two types of knowledge were different, and this is done away with by Quine, which makes him famous. And how does that affect ontology? Well, it plays perfectly into the whole issue of using predicate logic, because for us what's important are the relationships, as you heard in that movie. They're talking about it's the relationships, not the specific note, but rather the interrelationships between that note and other notes that creates melody. So the melody is the object, or the chord is the object, but not the specific note. So in that sense, when we're talking about ontology, notice our ontology now is based on the sets of characteristics that we predicate to a particular variable, which essentially depends on the conversation, on the subject matter. So as Quine was talking about, there's a language associated with biology, there's a language associated with anthropology, with psychology, etc., right? And that, by the way, that vocabulary is constantly developing as the specialists in that field develop new words for things like, you know, a wavicle, for example, in physics. What exactly is a wave, right? You know, the particle looks like a wave. On the other hand, it looks like a particle. So what is it? It's a wavicle, right? Right? You know, so they create new vocabulary. And of course, if you're a fluent speaker of that particular language, then basically you're familiar with what goes as objects in the ontology of that particular language, right? And it changes. You know, so if I'm in the grocery store, I'm not worried about the particular quarks that make up the orange. I'm wondering whether it's on sale and whether it tastes good, you know, et cetera, right? You know, it's a different environment, different language associated with that, and we generally think of our languages as attached to a form of life. So a lot of this comes from Ludwig Wittgenstein that gives us the language games. So Wittgenstein, language games. Now, it's not a game like Clue, chess, Parcheesi, or any of that sort of thing, but instead it's a concept that's associating with the way we use language in a particular form of life. That it's, in a sense, kind of a language game in that form of life. The kind of vocabulary you use, the rules that you have to follow in that particular language. Presidential language, you're not supposed to refer to countries that we have diplomatic relations with as asshole countries, for example. It's in the rules. Of course, some of the rules change, apparently, right? So there's all sorts of interesting things like that. What else? Is this interesting? Am I boring you to get to death with this topic? Let me ask some other questions. Did everybody turn in their first exam already? If you haven't, please do. Did everyone that sent the first exam in get a response back from me? If you did not, I don't have any, as of last night, I didn't have any left in my inbox. So please, and remember, don't send it to my son. There's just one letter difference. I could do something that would be fun. I like fun. But you have to know, remember, what's it? One thing, two thing. No. Who was the Dr. Seuss character that taught them how to have fun? I forget the name of the character. The one that had one thing, two thing. He had the cat in the hat. Okay, thanks. Okay, so this is I think I could find it. Maybe not. It should be pretty easy, actually, but wow, didn't even show up under that. Oh no, I guess that didn't work. I'm striking out here. I was going to show you some of my son's work, because he's an artist, and I have to be careful. I used to be much more critical of modern art, but now that I have a son who is a modern artist, I have to be careful, because I don't want to screw up his sales, I guess. Plus, this is the building where he got his Bachelor of Fine Arts. Then he went to Arizona State for his Master of Fine Arts. So I can do it this way, right? It's oddly, even though he's my son, we're friends on Facebook. That's good. Hey, there I am. Isn't that mean? That's me coming down the steps behind my aunt and her new husband. But what I wanted to show you, let's see, this is one of his things. Well, a lot of the art he has posted, though, are friends who also are artists. But so, like this. So what he does is he finds rocks or pieces of wood that he finds interesting, and he cuts them into pieces, and then he matches them with a template, and then he makes aluminum, which he paints and joins together with the piece. So it's mixed media, and that's art, I suppose. Well, I mean, by definition, it's art. Or he makes ceramics. It's still mixed media because he's got these metal, like they hold these ceramic pieces that hold the ceramic cups, so you can mount them on the wall. So he is kind of, well, I thought I had more art here, but I guess not. Shoot. Okay, well, that's enough of that. Oh, actually, this is interesting. That's me holding him. Obviously, he's a little bit smaller there. And that's my wife. And that's my cousin's wife and his two daughters. And we're standing in front of the Berlin Wall back in the day when the wall was still there. Oh, well, I'll quit. So I need to give you a quiz question. So how about this one? Back to Beethoven's symphony. What we were listening to, Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, were you listening to the symphony? There's lots of versions of it on there. I think the easy way of answering that would be to say yes, that is a performance of the symphony recorded live, but taped, and then made into a YouTube video. So you have to basically describe all the steps that are involved in that. Otherwise, it just seems very confusing to say that it's the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, right? Because that's the kind of thing that can be performed all over the place. What about the newest form? I think, would we call this the newest form of art? And that would be I don't know where I'm typing here. So this is something that you could do now, provided you have the right equipment. So what this, how many of you are familiar with tilt brush or other exemplars of this kind of thing? So if you have one of the goggle devices. I think the two main ones are Oculus Rift, which is owned by Facebook, I guess. And then the other one is Vive, or Vive, however you say, V-I-V-E, right? Among the programs that you can use with those devices is this particular program called Tilt Brush, which when you have the goggles on, it's sort of the 360 version of Paintbrush, right? If you remember that from your I mean, that's been around since Windows, right? And that's become more complex because they have 3D Paintbrush now too. But this works pretty much as you could see her doing. So once you have the goggles on and you have your hand controllers, the program basically gives you that palette, which has all sorts. That's why it's so many different sides to it, right? So you could pick all your colors, all your different brushes, all the different special effects, and so on. And you could literally then paint all around yourself, right? And create this 3D painting. So for example, one of my favorites is someone did a painting of Starry Night, the one by Van Gogh, right? Which is just obviously not exactly what Van Gogh did, but instead a takeoff on it, where you've got all this stuff, but all the stars are moving, you've got all this, light moving and everything else and everything, and you're of course in it. So you're totally surrounded by this artwork, right? And it's shareable, obviously, because the person could do it, and then I can download it and basically look at it the same way. I could edit it right in the program, right? You could do that. If I did, of course, I'd save it as a different file. But what exactly is it? It's art. Clearly, there's just some fantastic artists out there. By the way, I've tried this program and I'm absolutely pitiful. I can't even make a fireplace. I could get, the smoke and lights and stuff, but it's compared to the clearly absolutely brilliant stuff that some people are creating. There's always new stuff out there. This is like a new thing, right? But it's not like you could go into a museum and see it. The only way you can see it is to have the device, put it on, download it, and while you're wearing the goggles, you can see it, right? So it's not tangible, except for the digital program that enables you to experience it, right? So it's clearly art. There are clearly paintings. But at the same time, how do they get their existence, basically, right? They're totally dependent on this digital media. So, if something happens to the infrastructure, if the programs change, that happens. How many times have your computers upgraded in your lifetime, and then the old stuff totally disappears, right? Wow, it's gone, right? So it's much more fragile than paper, for example, which, you could go and find copies of, the Bible from Qumran, which are, had to be put back together, but nonetheless, we're still there, from, 64 AD, or whatever, right? So interesting question, how this works, right? Was that fun? How many would love to have me bring that in so you could see how it works? That would be fun. Of course, if we have 46 people, that would be a long line of stuff. Plus, I'd probably have to use like some sort of special wipe oh well, who knows? One of these days, if you get the chance. If you get the chance, Best Buy, I think, has these on display. I'm not suggesting you go out and spend $1,000 plus on these devices. Actually,
has one that students can use to study time in the library.
they have one in the library?
Yeah, there's a whole room that has a whole bunch of like crazy expensive electronics that you just have to go in, sign in, and say what you want to do.
No kidding. I'll have to visit. That would be
That's
fun.
in the second level.
Uh-huh. Well, thank you.
And not many people know about it.
It's a well-kept secret, I suppose. And the folks that enjoy going there figure, well, the more people that know, the less time I'll have on it. So I understand why they don't go out and tell everyone. I cheat because I have one at my house. And it was actually that program that inspired me to get it. Because I thought, gosh, that looks cool. I want to do that. And I did. Of course, the only problem with it is it turns out to be like any other skill that needs practice. And you know, I'd love to do all kinds of great artwork, but you know what? It takes a lot of time, as you can imagine. You know, you're not just painting on a flat thing. You can go like this, and of course you've got all kinds of things going on, but to make it worth. Yeah, it's going to be a lot more effort.
Well, have a fantastic day.
You too.